Yes, we will be talking about religion, faith, and minorities. Welcome to the final session of our conference. We have online participation as well. One of our panelists will be delivering their talk online. So I think we're good to go. Let me introduce our speakers to you. First of all, Christopher Sheklian is with us, joining us for this panel.
Liturgy, Ecclesiology, and Minority Rights. Christopher Sheklian is a postdoctoral researcher at Radboud University in Nijmegen, the Netherlands, and he works as part of the Rewriting Global Orthodoxy project in the Faculty of Philosophy, Theology, and Religion. He received his PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago in 2017. The title of his doctoral dissertation is Theology and the Community, the Armenian Minority, Tradition and Secularism in Turkey. His published work explores the role of liturgy and law in the lives of religious minorities, migration and emplacement, and the question of secularism in relation to religious minority rights. Currently, he's working on a monograph entitled Liturgical Rights, Armenian Christian Minority Presence in Turkey. The title of his presentation is Liturgy, Ecclesiology, and Minority Rights. So please go ahead, Christopher.
Hrant Think Vakfına teşekkür ederim. Of the organizers, thank you. Thank you to everybody else who is here at the final panel, sticking it out and staying with us. I appreciate it. I'm also really grateful because a lot of the background work for some of the things I'm going to talk about has been done. So you'll see in what I present that I'm very lucky to be towards the end, actually, with all of the conceptual work that's been done. So, without further ado. Easter Sunday 2014, I had the privilege of serving on the altar of the famed Surpgiragos Armenian Church in Diyarbakir. At the time, I was living in Istanbul, conducting ethnographic fieldwork with the Armenian community, especially Armenian Apostolic Christians. The year before I arrived in 2012, the first service in decades had been held at the recently renovated church. Armenians, especially Dikiranagertsis, came from Istanbul and around the world to worship in the massive church and to affirm their place in the historic central municipality of Sur. At the time, the Kurdish mayor of the municipality, Abdullah Demirbash, supported the reconstruction and publicly advocated for a politics that included minority populations, Kurdish, Armenian, or otherwise, in the history and governance of the city. In this context, the renovation of the church, supported by the still active Vakif, or Endowed Foundation, now mostly based in Istanbul, took place. The consummation of this renovation was a liturgical act on the pinnacle of the Armenian liturgical year, the day that appropriately celebrates resurrection and new life. After a hiatus in 2013, Easter Sunday liturgy was again celebrated in 2014, when I had the opportunity as a deacon of the Armenian Church to join the contingent sent by the Patriarchate and serve on the festive occasion. During interviews and conversations throughout the weekend, the role of the church in the broader conception of Armenian presence and community in the region became clear. One man, who noted that he was one of the rare Muslim Armenians in the region who could trace his Armenian past through both parents, told me he had made the journey from nearby to attend the service and the broader celebration. When asked about Armenian Christianity, he reiterated he was a devout Muslim. While he had no intention of conversion, he insisted on the importance of Surpgiragos. Crucially, it was not just the physical site of the church as a vakif or as a gathering place that was important to him. He insisted to me that the Patriarchate should assign a permanent priest to the church. For him, even as a Muslim Armenian, sacramental and liturgical activity at Surpgiragos remained the fullest manifestation of Armenian presence in the city. Only through this liturgical activity and presence was the fullness of an Armenian minority form of life in the region possible. Thus, we find in the liturgical activity of the Armenian Apostolic Church and its conception of the church, that is, Ecclesiology, a specific notion of Armenian collectivity, an idea of Armenian community. I want to be clear at the outset that this idea of community, which the paper will attend to with a little bit of theological care, has historically been the normative idea of the Armenian community in Turkey. We can think of Harag's presentation earlier today. Zabel Yasayan's beloved memoirs, for instance, contain a stark episode related to her by her grandmother, so we could place the event in the early to mid-19th century, which demonstrated the power of the Patriarchate to police moral behavior among Armenians. Historical work on the treatment of the Armenian Catholics in the 18th century makes it absolutely clear that an ecclesial demarcation of the Armenian community through liturgy and the sacraments of the Armenian Apostolic Church has not only been a normative project, but often a discriminatory or exclusionary one. Nonetheless, I think there are important reasons to reconsider this liturgical, sacramental, ecclesial conception of the Armenian community on the 100th anniversary of the Treaty of Lausanne and the formation of the Turkish Republic. First, and most practically, most Armenians in Istanbul continue, at least nominally and through the minimal participation in the sacrament of baptism, to be affiliated with the Armenian Orthodox Church, Apostolic Church. Attention to the role of the Church, its dynamics, and the actual mechanisms by which the theology and practice of the Church constitutes a community provides a crucial starting point for understanding the lives of these Armenians. Such attention also offers a better grasp of the current role of the Church in the landscape of contemporary Armenian politics of Turkey. Slower. Okay. Accounts that ignore the actual theology and liturgy, to say nothing of polemical dismissals of the institution, risk an impoverished grounding for understanding, both for understanding and political action. Second, as is frequently noted, the only explicit mention of minorities in the Treaty of Lausanne, and therefore the only minority groups that have a clear legal claim in the juridical framework establishing the Turkish Republic, are religious minorities, namely non-Muslim minorities. This is where I get to benefit from 2 days of conceptual work on this topic. Thus, how to demarcate, define, recognize these groups is arguably the foundation of all minority politics in the Republic. This paper argues that the liturgical, sacramental, and ecclesiological self-understanding of the Armenian Apostolic Church is in tension with the legal guarantees of religious minority rights as set out in the treaty. These guarantees have not been kept, in part because of outright refusal on the part of the Turkish state to do so, and in part because of the secular legal foundations of the Republic and a broader impossibility of clearly defining what counts as religion. However, the paper suggests that even when guarantees for minority protection based on rights are respected, when they are fully functioning, that there is still something in the liturgical instantiation of an Armenian presence that eludes a politics of minority protection built on the conceptions of rights. In what follows, I first look at the guarantees set out in the Treaty of Lausanne that explicitly take up religion. I point to some of the conceptual difficulties in these guarantees that have allowed the Turkish state to ignore, bypass, or otherwise invalidate aspects of the minority protection regime. Then, I briefly describe the instantiation of a collective Armenian presence through liturgy, grounded in the ecclesiology of the Armenian Apostolic Church. I end by suggesting why this instantiation of presence may elude protection by even the most well-meaning guarantees of rights. So first, let's take a look here at religion in the treaty. And as we've heard on one reading, we could consider the entirety of Section 3 governing the protection of minorities as having to do something with religion, right? As Harag pointed out earlier today, nearly all of the invocations of minority start with non-Muslim minority. So from that perspective, we could say, aha, all of Section 3 could in part be considered about religious rights. So that said, let's take a bit of a closer look. So Article 38 assures full and complete protection of life and liberty to all inhabitants of Turkey without distinction of birth, nationality, language, race, or religion. It goes on immediately to the free exercise of religion and then specifically mentions these non-Muslim minorities. All of the remaining sections, articles in Section 3 begin with references to these non-Muslim minorities. Okay. So, as I've suggested elsewhere, and I'm happy to discuss during the question and answer period, a foundational conundrum for Armenians and other non-Muslim minorities in the Republic of Turkey thus comes into view here. Their protections are guaranteed by reference to their religious difference, yet the near simultaneous foundation of Turkey as a secular country denies precisely that religious difference should matter for politics and governance. So you get to make a rights claim grounded in the treaty because of religious difference, and this comes into tension with other legal foundations of the Republic. And while this conundrum is acute for non-Muslims in Turkey, it's indicative of a broader problem relating to the nature of political secularism and religious difference. What counts as a religious practice? Who gets to decide? Winifred Sullivan has famously argued in The Impossibility of Religious Freedom that ultimately religion is always entangled in juridical processes of definition where certain practices are legally defined as either religious or non-religious and then administered accordingly. Hussein Ali Agrama, looking at the case of Egypt, has defined what he calls the active principle of secularism, whereby we should understand secularism not just as the separation of religion from politics, but the ongoing demarcation of religion from politics and other spheres of life, where the sovereign power to decide that demarcation lies with the state. Often, Agrama suggests, the very indeterminacy of the boundary between religion and politics is what justifies state intervention, thereby deepening the entanglement of the state in questions of religion. Earlier today, we had a very wonderful talk about how the governance through ambiguity. I think this resonates with that idea. So let us consider this in the case of Turkey in light of the minority provisions in the Treaty of Lausanne. The treaty guarantees that non-Muslim minorities in the Republic of Turkey should be able to exercise their own religion freely within any charitable, religious, and social institutions, any schools and other establishments for instruction and education they have established. That's Article 40. We can note two things immediately in this key article. First, there's no guidelines as to what constitutes free exercise or what exactly it is that's to be freely exercised. This is Sullivan's point. In her book, practices at a cemetery in Boca Raton, Florida were deemed idiosyncratic and personal and therefore not part of an established religious practice. Therefore, they were excluded from the protection as a religious practice. In Turkey, collective religious practice has likewise been privileged, in part due to the long-standing recognition of the Armenian Patriarchate as the ultimate authority of the religious and often broader Armenian community. We can point to Ohannes's work, which has been mentioned earlier. Yet at the same time, certain parts of the free exercise of religion have been curtailed. Most notably, we can point to the unofficial ban on the building of new churches, the recent high-profile consecration of a Syriac church here in Istanbul notwithstanding. Whereas the consecration of churches, especially in places where a need for ministry is felt, could be seen as part of the free exercise of religion, in Turkey this has been curtailed. The second thing to note in Article 40 is that free exercise is placed within a set of institutions that are then subject to other laws and regulations. For instance, as I've argued elsewhere, the Vakif status has been key to certain properties retaining their function as churches. In Diyarbakir, the reconstruction of the church and its reconsecration as a church where liturgy, as the free exercise of religion, could take place depended in large part on the fact that its vakif was maintained even when the building was in disrepair. In contrast, the famous Surphaç Cathedral on the island of Akdamar, without official status as a foundation, is subject to the whims of the Turkish state. Liturgical services take place at what is technically a museum, only through the approval of the Turkish state. Thus, the free exercise guaranteed in Article 40 is, one, unclear as to what constitutes free exercise, and allows for the Turkish state to appeal to other factors, like embedding the idea of free exercise within certain institutions in order to limit that free exercise. Another important way that free exercise of religion is limited is through a caveat immediately inserted into the treaty, the concept of public order, which we see in Article 43. I'm not going to detail this specifically regarding non-Muslims, but I bring it to attention here for a couple of reasons. First, this idea of public order has been used in many contexts to limit worship practices, with considerable scholarly attention, especially on how this has happened in Egypt. Hussein Agrama, for instance, argues that public order is essential to the functioning of political secularism. Further historic research on the deployment of public order, specifically vis-a-vis the governance of non-Muslims here in Turkey, would prove fruitful. I point to the concept in this paper to demonstrate that even within the provisions of the Treaty of Lausanne, there are legal tools that make it possible to circumvent the right to the free exercise of religion. Two other elements in the Treaty of Lausanne dealing with religion connect this legal terrain to arguments made by scholars of the critical study of secularism in other contexts. I pointed them here to suggest that the precarious status of religious minorities in the Republic of Turkey is due not only to willful negligence on the part of the Turkish state, but also to structural conundrums at the heart of the concepts of religion, minority rights, and secularism that are foundational for the governance of non-Muslims in Turkey. Article 43 guarantees that non-Muslim minorities shall not be compelled to perform any act which constitutes a violation of their faith or religious observances. So here we see a partial reduction of religion to conscience and to faith as a set of precepts to which one adheres. The critical study of secularism has repeatedly noted this limitation of what constitutes religion, the circumscription of religion to a private sphere delineated by personal faith. Likewise, in Article 42, family law and personal status, aspects of human life and sociality that have broad consequences for collective existence, are placed within the bounds of custom and are given over to the religious. In other words, the secular delineation of the religious from the public and the political includes the relegations of questions of family and gender to the religious. So, thus far, I've pointed to parts of the treaty that explicitly deal with religion and the free exercise of religion. We could do more of this, but instead what I'd like to do is think about how that when we consider religious minority rights, the definition of religion and the encounter with secular legal principles already hinders the ability of these minority rights to secure the protection of religious practice. So there's another way here that minority rights as they're delineated in the treaty and the broader rights regime might be insufficient for the protection of what I call a minority form of life, and for constructing a robust minority politics that takes the role of the Armenian Apostolic Church in collective existence seriously. This stems from the conception of the collectivity internal to the Armenian Apostolic Church and what I call the modes of presence-making that disclose this collectivity. Namely, it's not just the free exercise of religion that is important to the instantiation of the Armenian Church, but a specifically liturgical mode of engagement. Armenian ecclesiology and its conception of itself as a church, like many other ancient churches, which include the Eastern Greek Orthodox and the Catholic, is deeply liturgical and Eucharistic. So what do I mean? Let's take an example from a festal Saturday in Istanbul. Saturdays in the Armenian Apostolic Church are reserved for celebrations of major saints. For instance, all 3 days commemorating St. Gregory the Illuminator are on a Saturday. As you may know, the dozens of Armenian churches scattered around the city mark a late 19th century or early 20th century geography when the population of Armenians in the city was at its peak. Today, there are many churches in neighborhoods where few Armenians live. Yet, as active vakifs, liturgical services are still sometimes held there. Often these are on these big festal days. So for instance, Surp Nishan in Kartal might host services on feasts of the cross. Nishan, meaning sign, is used in Armenian to refer to the cross. So such festal days demonstrate the fullness of liturgical and Eucharistic presence. Armenians come from around the city on pilgrimage, we can say, and the celebrant is often the patriarch himself, or a bishop or clergyman designated by the patriarchate. In the ancient and early ecclesiology of the church, which we get a glimpse of already in the letters of Paul addressed to the house churches in the various cities of the Mediterranean, like Ephes, and which is described in some detail already in the 2nd century by other theologians, all the Christians of the city come together for one Eucharistic meal, partaking of Holy Communion in remembrance of the Lord, with the bishop presiding. Orthodox theologians like John Zizelus have developed this conception of the church, again, ecclesiology, where the fullness of the church exists precisely in the common partaking of Holy Communion by all of those present. Liturgical assembly, especially for the Eucharistic partaking of Holy Communion, is thus at the heart of an Armenian ecclesiology that is simultaneously an instantiation of a conception of community. In this ecclesiology, two presences, both metaphorically understood as the body of Christ, are brought together. First, the people, still at this point a collection of individuals, must be present. Anyone can come, and any baptized Armenian Apostolic Christian can and should receive Holy Communion. So we see the presence of the people not yet bound together. The second presence, that of Jesus Christ, of God himself in and through the Eucharist, the body and blood of Jesus Christ, is what binds the people becoming the body of Christ. So we have what's a kind of double metaphorical usage of the idea of the body of Christ that perfectly encapsulates this double presence of liturgical activity. You come together to worship and partake of the body of Jesus in the Eucharist, and doing so creates the body of Christ of the Church. So Eucharistic presence, the presence of the divine through liturgy, instantiates a kind of presence of the people through liturgy. So I think I'm a little low on time, and I've been speaking quickly. So in what remains, I want to think about if thinking through a kind of right to liturgy makes any sense at all with this. So we see the rights enumerated in the Treaty of Lausanne coming out of a particular framework for minority rights, which reached their peak precisely in the interwar period. So yesterday, for instance, Fernand talked about the human rights of minorities. Right? This is a different legal regime than what the Treaty of Lausanne has, where minority rights are taken at a collective moment. And we see this throughout the treaty, right? The rights of non-Muslim minorities. They're protected from mostly at a kind of collective level. So given that liturgy is a collective endeavor, we could maybe see this as being protected through the rights that are enumerated in the Treaty of Lausanne. And indeed, we could mobilize them. We can see this in the free exercise of religion and some of these other minority rights. But I want to suggest that the instantiation of liturgical presence actually brings with it the entire theological structure and form of the Armenian Christian, to be in communion with one another, to incarnate Christ in the particular theological understanding of the Armenian Church, to enact the people simultaneously with this particular theological present-making. A rite, even let's say if there was a special rite to liturgy, probably doesn't account for this Eucharistic presence-making. It targets external practices, making sure that religious expression isn't hindered. But it's the full mustering of the Armenian Christian presence in and through liturgy, the full ecclesiological understanding of the Armenian Apostolic Church that's enacted in this liturgy. Even if this ecclesiological delimitation of the Armenian community has its problems, it's important to recognize that a tradition-centered form of Armenian life is disclosed and linked to this liturgical practice. Making present a collective Armenian existence in and through liturgy is a dynamic that's not reducible to the freedom of, say, religious expression, isolated from other aspects of Armenian Christian life. It is the very instantiation of an Armenian presence through liturgy. Neither the provisions of the Treaty of Lausanne nor really any legal conception of rights can reasonably be expected to encompass this liturgical presence. Thank you.
Thank you. And we will turn to our second speaker, Howard Eissenstat. Howard Eissenstat is an associate professor of history at St. Lawrence University, where he's teaching courses on Middle East history and politics, and he's also a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. He received his PhD in modern Middle East history from UCLA, where he wrote his dissertation on the interplay between Muslim identity and Turkish nationalism in the late Ottoman Empire and the early Turkish Republic. Eissenstat also served as a Turkey country specialist for Amnesty International and was the primary author of the Turkey section of the Freedom House annual report between the years 2018 and 20. He mostly writes on contemporary Turkish domestic and foreign policy, especially on the issues of rule of law, minority rights, and the reshaping of political culture under the AKP. So the title of his presentation is On Diversity, Tolerance, and the AK Party, Considering Convergences and Divergences at the Republic's Centenary.
I'd like to first thank the Hrant Dink Bab for the opportunity to be with you today. It's a very special opportunity for me. I've learned a tremendous amount, both from the panels and from the discussions after the panels, so I want to thank you all. And I'd also like to thank the foundation staff who've been extremely patient with me this last couple of days. The work I present to you today comes out of a larger project which aims to contextualize the last 20 years in the context of the last 100 years. It's in some sense trying to make sense of where the AKP is within Republican history. It's also sort of my thinking through the debates that are going on in Turkish historiography about post-Kemalism and post-Kemalism, and lots of heated discussions there. A couple of notes. The first is that today's presentation is primarily oriented towards the role of a discourse of tolerance in foreign policy, a sort of bookend to a paper that I presented last weekend on US-Turkish relations. And the second is that every time I say the word tolerance, you have to imagine the quotation marks around it, because I'm not really interested in actual tolerance for the purposes of this paper so much as I'm interested in its performative value in foreign policy. And I guess, thinking through, Chris's presentation and that anecdote at the beginning, why do we have these sorts of events over the last 20 years in a way that we didn't prior to that? And what is their value in an electoral situation where non-Muslims don't really matter very much, at least not as voters, and in which the general trajectory of the country has been towards more authoritarianism? Why these demonstrations of tolerance, again, tırnaklar içinde? I'd like to start out by noting that I do not plan to, in this paper, to chronicle the painful story of discrimination of non-Muslims and other religious minorities in Turkey, either now or in the past. For my purposes, those painful truths are given, documented both in the existing scholarship and in the exciting work of the colleagues who presented this weekend. My focus today is on exploring the ways in which the Turkish government has instrumentalized the frequently invoked narratives of Turkey as a haven for religious refugees, as a country, again with quotation marks, with no tradition of racism or discrimination, as a nation marked by a distinctive tolerance. In particular, I'm interested in this discussion in exploring the ways in which the framework of a distinctively tolerant Turkish nation has been instrumentalized, weaponized in Turkey's diplomatic outreach to Turkey's Western partners, in my view, most especially the United States. This effort is what I would refer to as the politics of tolerance in this paper, public demonstrations of goodwill to Turkey's religious minorities as a means of building positive responses in the West. There is, of course, a domestic component to this story as well, and perhaps if I have the opportunity to develop this into a full paper, I'll explore that as well. In the domestic sphere, there are perhaps more fault lines in the story. The narrative of a Turkey free of racism has helped to erase public memory of the 1915 genocide, of pogroms that came before and after 1915, and the long history of discrimination that has shaped Turkish political culture up to the present. What makes the domestic story complicated is that the narrative of a tolerant nation has always been coupled domestically with frequent and varied stories of non-Muslims as natural enemies of Turkey. The frequent fantasies on the Turkish right that Armenians or crypto-Armenians are the secret hand behind the PKK, or the anti-Semitic tropes of an international Jewish conspiracy, a secret hand, as Prime Minister Erdogan framed it behind the Gezi protests. The Turkish narrative of tolerance directed at Western audiences is, in fact, much more straightforward and has been aimed at deflecting criticism and winning support from abroad. It has been, when it works, a particularly effective aspect of Turkey's public diplomacy and has been used frequently for much of Turkey's history. Discussions of the instrumentalization of a narrative of tolerance have been discussed before, most notably in the remarkable body of scholarship produced by Rifat Bali, and also in David Baer's recent monograph, Sultanic Saviors, and Tolerant Turks. This paper builds on that scholarship by focusing on the ways that the AKP has since 2002 honed and amplified that tradition. I think it's worthwhile to consider the AKP period in this context because I think the inclination, both on the part of the AKP's advocates and its detractors, has been to focus on the cleavages between the AKP's policies and those of its predecessors. The breaks with the past are self-evident, of course, but I think they are too often overstated. In particular, in its savvy use of the narrative of tolerance as a tool of diplomacy, I see the AKP as less a rupture with the Kemalist past than surpassing it in its effectiveness. The Kemalist tradition has been, in this regard, documented by scholars like Rifat Bali and Ber, and began almost literally at the beginning of the Republic with the inclusion of Chaim Nahum in the Turkish delegation at Lausanne, and perhaps reached its most intense iteration in the mobilization of leading figures of Turkish Jewry to counter Armenian genocide recognition efforts in the 1980s and 90s. As Bali and many scholars after him have noted, the massive public diplomacy associated with the Quincentennial Foundation was specifically weaponized as part of Turkey's efforts to combat genocide recognition and as part of Turkey's public diplomacy to cement ties with the United States. In its first years, the AKP was particularly effective in leveraging the discourse of tolerance to its political advantage. By leaning into long-standing strategy in new ways, it won plaudits from the West and a considerable degree of popular support from unlikely allies at home. I fear we can be overly cynical in dismissing the liberalism of the AKP's, in quotation marks, liberal phase. Some of its liberalization efforts were clearly to play for Western support against the military. At the same time, I've had the opportunity to interview some of the early leaders of the AKP who were later pushed to the periphery as President Erdogan consolidated power. And it's clear to me that for all their limitations in how they envision the Turkish Republic and all their limitations in how they look at their own legacy, that they were genuine in their hopes for a more liberal, tolerant Turkey under AKP rule, and resent the direction that he took the country as he consolidated his power over the party. If we're going to criticize those former leaders, it is likely that their flaws were less in their vision than in what they did, that they did not have the courage or popular support to stand up to Erdogan as the AKP became more authoritarian. The first 5 or 6 years of the AKP's rule also represented a high tide for its liberalism for several reasons. First, ideological divides within the AKP were still unresolved. The consolidation of the party as an emanation of Erdogan's personal ambition was not yet fixed, and in this context, those figures, most notably Abdullah Gül, who were genuinely sympathetic to a liberalization of Turkish society, still had a role in forming political decisions. That is to say, today's AKP is a different institution than it was 15 years ago. Second, Turkey's ambitions for the EU membership, and failing that, of using EU instruments to move its own priorities forward, remained active at least through 2008 or so. And it's worth recalling in this context that the vast majority of 301 cases that sort of dominated the news cycle in those years were brought by nationalist critics of the AKP, like Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. Anybody remember him? Who is hoping to embarrass the AKP and stymie EU accession process. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the AKP used the positive press generated by liberalization to generate Western support in its efforts to peripheralize the military. As the military became peripheral, it became less important to gain that support. All periodization is somewhat arbitrary, but the end of the era came to a close in the period between 2008 and 2011, when the AKP made its first effective alliance with the MHP. The AKP got the MHP's support for broadening freedom on the headscarf question, central to both the AKP's leadership and its base, while the MHP was able to stem the AKP's support for broader reforms. As Jenny White noted at the time, the AKP needed the votes of the nationalist anti-minority MHP in parliament to lift a ban on headscarves. In return, the AKP has announced that it is backing down from its minorities bill that would have had, among other things, returned property and assets that had been confiscated from Christian, Jewish, and other minority religious groups by the state. A later version was eventually passed. By 2011, with the final marginalization of the military from decision-making, and certainly by 2013, when Erdogan accomplished his final consolidation of control over the party in the wake of Gezi, the liberal era of the AKP was clearly at an end. All that said, it's worth noting just how radical a break from the past Turkey made under AKP leadership in its first years, particularly as it relates to treatments of non-Muslims and other diversity-related issues. The first Pride March was held in 2003, and by the end of the decade had become a major event involving tens of thousands, before restrictions were again imposed beginning in 2015. The full list of reforms during the first decade of AKP power is too long to provide here, and is already well covered in the scholarship, but includes the first Protestant church in Turkey, opened in 2007, the restoration of Akdemir Church in Van, and several other important Christian and Jewish religious sites. In 2005, after considerable haggling within the ruling party, the first public scholarly conference of the Armenian genocide was held at Bilgi University, with many who are in the audience today attending then. In 2010, for the first time since 1919, public commemorations of the Armenian genocide were held in Istanbul. It's fair to note that at least some of these reforms had already begun under the pressure of EU accession process under the Ecevit government, and that many of these reforms elicited considerable tension within the AKP itself. Nonetheless, the first decade was a heady one for those seeking a reorientation of Turkish nationalism and a break with the taboos of the past. What I'd like to underline 4 points with regard to the AKP's politics of tolerance and the change in tone that the AKP moved towards in its second decade in power. First, these policies resulted in considerable tensions within the AKP coalition. As Erdogan consolidated full control over the party, the process of reform was more limited, though Erdogan continues to engage in the politics of tolerance to this day. As revolutionary as they seem, these reforms in many respects are less a break from the Kemalist past than a radical enlargement of the politics of tolerance as a means to generate favorable treatment in the foreign press and win plaudits in the West. They reflected less a willingness to break from state nationalism than an eagerness to demonstrate state largesse. The very framing of these reforms as demonstrations of a, quote, Turkish tradition of tolerance highlights how much of these reforms mirrored the language of the mid-1980s and early 90s, when the Turkish government mobilized its presumed absence of anti-Semitism as a way of combating Armenian genocide recognition. 3. The reforms were also a reflection of new media environments sparked by the rise of social media, but the assumption of a central monolithic Turkish culture defined by the state was never really brought into question. The fact that these reforms largely failed to address the interests of Alevis, of Kurds, of non-believing Turkish citizens underlines this. So too does the radical constraints on public discourse imposed in the post-Gezi era, and the extent to which these constraints have changed the domestic environment in the years since. 4. The politics of tolerance was always more about representing Turkey to the outside world, and especially to the West, rather than appealing to domestic audiences. The breakdown of EU accession and the growing distrust of the West after Gezi and the attempted coup of 2016, both of which Erdogan believes were inspired by the West and funded by the United States, is a key component of the government's diminished interest in them. The period between Gezi and the attempted coup in 2016 correspond both to the radical limitations on press freedom and civil society and the full consolidation of Erdogan's control over state functions. It did not, however, end the politics of tolerance so much as cement Erdogan's starring role in it. On major Christian and Jewish holidays, President Erdogan offers his congratulations to the appropriate communities and uses the opportunity to praise not only their contributions to Turkey, but also, and perhaps more importantly, He could congratulate Turkey's own largesse as a tolerant nation. There has also been an increased focus on demonstrating Turkey's goodwill to Turkish Jewry. The past decade has witnessed the restoration and renovation of a number of synagogues in Turkey, including several in Izmir, one in Kilis, and another in Edirne. This is all laudable, but since there are few, if any, Turkish Jews left in those places, it's worth considering exactly why that has been a focus at all. The answer to this puzzle lies, I think, in Erdogan's personal anti-Semitism and his recognition that he's vulnerable to criticism just on that score in the West. The emphasis on Jewry within the politics of tolerance comes at a time when anti-Semitic imagery has become a mainstay of Turkish state television, seen repeatedly in programs like The Last Emperor, in Erdogan's veiled references to an interest lobby and a mastermind behind domestic dissent, in his obsession with Jewish financier George Soros, and his not infrequent inclination to talk about Jews and Israel interchangeably. It's also evident in the frequent recourse to anti-Semitic tropes in the pro-AKP press. This baseline anti-Semitism isn't particularly surprising, perhaps. He's, after all, very much a child of the Milli tradition. His favorite poet is Necip Fazıl Kısakürek. Aykan Erdemir has written about his high school days, and apparently Erdogan directed and starred in a play called Mason Communist Jew, in which a Jewish agitator poses as a Muslim Turk to incite workers against a factory owner. It concludes apparently with one devoutly Muslim character reciting the moral of the story: all evil regimes are Jewish inventions. If he was doing that in his late teens or early 20s, it's not clear to me how far he's come in the interim. Erdogan regularly states, and may even believe, that anti-Semitism is a crime against humanity and foreign to Turkish culture. It certainly doesn't follow that he doesn't regularly embrace anti-Semitism in his worldview. Many racists declaim their utter lack of racism, after all. Indeed, the politics of tolerance may be a reflection both of Erdogan's awareness that he is susceptible to accusations of anti-Semitism and his fundamental belief that Jews are a powerful secret hand behind much that goes on in the world. So far as I can tell, each and every time that President Erdogan goes to the United States, he has made an effort to meet what are repeatedly described as Jewish leaders. He doesn't do this with other communities. These meetings are typically closed door and are a distinctive element of Erdogan's diplomatic efforts. They are, no doubt, accompanied with fulsome denunciations of anti-Semitism and long stories about Turkey's history of tolerance. And depending on the historical moment, I don't expect it to happen this month, perhaps some general statements of goodwill towards Israel. They are also, from the standpoint of intra-NATO relations, extremely odd. Why should the president of Turkey expend so much time and energy, an hour out of his busy schedule, or a couple of hours out of his busy schedule on a couple of days in the United States, engaging with unelected leaders of a religious minority, particularly one which numbers less than 2% of the US population, and I'm happy to discuss numbers later, less than 15,000 souls in his own country of 85 million. At one level, it reflects a continuity with the strategy going back many decades in Turkish diplomacy, which has posed American Jewry as a useful counterweight to Greek and Armenian lobbies, which Ankara has regularly blamed for its troubles in Congress. And having worked with Congress, the role of minority lobbies on what Turkey's travails in Congress is wildly overstated. It is also an acknowledgement that Erdogan is particularly vulnerable on the question of anti-Semitism. And last but certainly not least, these meetings are a reflection of that very anti-Semitism, of the old anti-Semitic trope of Jewish power, that somehow Jewish goodwill is a necessary key to good relations with the United States. That for all Erdogan fears them, his country's interests are served by positive engagement with Jewish leaders. In this, President Erdogan's reliance on the politics of tolerance is both a continuation and a shift in traditions that have played a role in Turkish public diplomacy for many decades. It reflects not so much an embrace of minorities as a weaponization of the tropes of tolerance for political purposes. It is likely to survive even as the communities that it claims to embrace continue to diminish in their native land. Thank you.
Teşekkürler Howard. Son konu.
Thank you very much, Howard. Our last speaker is Angelo Carlucci, who will be joining us online via Zoom.
Angelo Carlucci has his PhD in political science from Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University. He successfully defended a dissertation with the title Religious Communities and Politics in Turkey, the Case of Menzil in the Post-2000 Era, which focuses on the relationship between Sufi brotherhoods and politics in contemporary Turkey. His research interests concentrate on the relationship between religion and politics in Turkey, Sufism and vernacular religion in Turkey and Central Asia. Angelo Carlucci'nin sunum başlığı Türkiye'de Alevilerin dini hakları.
His presentation is Alevis struggle for their rights in Turkey. Over to you.
Many thanks, Ayşe, and I hope that you can hear me. Okay, right. I'm going to share my screen for my presentation, if I can find it. Yeah, just one moment. Okay, here we are. I hope that you can see my presentation because I will present from my computer, so it's better to have a presentation instead of just seeing me. I mean, first of all, thanks you all, because this issue is very new for me, because usually I study about Sufism and stuff, so this is a new opportunity for me to learn about something different, and without losing many other time, I'm going to present. So, liberty of observing a religion is one of the fundamental rights and freedoms protected by national and international conventions, both by the United Nations and the United Europe, and it follows that the right to have places of worship is an indispensable element for the realization of this right. The Republic of Turkey fully subscribes this assumption, if only because it participates in institutions and organizations such as the Council of Europe that postulates and defend it. The problem with international convention, however, concerns between the principles expressed in the documents and their practical application. But the issue concerning the rights of minority and their places of worship is particularly pressing in the Anatolian country, especially regarding the Alevis. Just sorry, I think it's better. Yes. The issue concerning the rights of the minority and their places of worship is particularly pressing in the Anatolian country, especially regarding the Alevis. Therefore, it describes the hardships faced by this minority, and in particular by addressing the issue of difficulties in the construction and maintenance of their places of worship. I'm sorry, I'm self in the microphone. It's quite annoying. Maybe lower the volume.
Can you try again?
Yeah, I'm speaking. Okay, don't worry. In any case, we were speaking about Alevis, and a few words about the Alevis are required here. Alevism is yet to be defined properly in both social studies and Turkish socio-political reality. It is from time to time described as a syncretic religion belonging to the broader family of Islam, as a religion in its own right, as a culture, or both. Attempts to circumscribe it to a religious or cultural reality have often led to controversy. The present study does not aim to contextualize
Excuse
Alevis
me,
identity.
Angela and Angelo. Maybe if you turn off your camera, it would help the connection. And try to be close to the microphone. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. We were speaking about Alevis, and we were saying that in any case, Alevis have different necessities from that of Orthodox Muslims, especially concerning the places of worship. Indeed, Alevis gather in Gemelli,
Excuse me.
and religious celebration.
I think there is something wrong with the audio setups. Can you go to the audio settings and reduce the noise reduction and try again, because we're having hard time hearing you.
Just a moment. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
It's better.
Lower the noise reduction or no noise reduction.
I already did it.
Are you using headphones?
Yes, I'm using headphones. Wired headphones.
Okay, let's try
Can you
like
hear
this.
me? It's better.
You can keep going.
Okay, it is better right now. Okay.
It seems like an internet problem.
With my connection.
Could you try reconnecting, Angelo? Because we are having a really tough time. Literally, we can't hear anything.
I will try to recognize. Just one moment. So we were speaking about Gemevleri, and we were saying that gatherings and religious celebration in Gemevleri are not part of the Alevi tradition, but are a rather recent phenomenon. The emergence of the first of the Gemevleri dates back to the 60s, and it's a product of Alevi's migration to the bigger city. The vertiginous growth of the biggest cities, especially since the 80s, has led to a progressive evolution in the Alevi practices, now no longer observed outdoors or in private homes. Thus, the need to have a place dedicated to the celebration of rites, especially funeral services, has emerged. Gemevleri importance in the eyes of the Alevis is not only based on religion. They offer other services in addition to devotional ones, such as courses on Alevi traditions, which represents a space for integration and a reserved place where this minority can socialize. Indeed, Martin van Bruynesen believes that the emergence of Gemevleri and their proliferation has contributed both to the survival of Alevis in an urban environment and to the emergence of a new awareness about Alevis regarding their identity that was getting lost in the new environment in which they were living. But building a Gemevi and maintaining it is therefore a right that Alevis should freely enjoy. But in reality, this minority faces several difficulties in doing so. Indeed, Gemevleri are not recognized as places of worship by the Turkish law, with the negative consequences that this entails. First, it means that it's difficult to find where to construct such buildings. In urban development plans, municipal authorities provide for plots reserved for the construction of places of worship. However, Alevis cannot apply to occupy these plots with a GMV because of the limitation imposed by law. Based on the current regulatory situation, the only legal way to build a GMV is either by designing it as a building belonging to other NEC or AVACUF, it means to an association or to a pious foundation. Many Alevi associations decided to illegally build a GMV, even without obtaining the necessary permits, while others managed to build one where the local municipalities turned a blind eye. In Istanbul in 2008, local authorities run by the opposition party Cumhuriyet Halk Partisi decided on their initiative to recognize cemevleri as places of worship. Further informal measures in this regard were taken in subsequent years, but despite the importance that such openings may have for the local Alevi activists, they do not provide the necessary security or peace of mind that only a formal measure can guarantee. In some cases, the government has intervened stopping the construction of a GMV, even in the presence of compliant local authorities. In these cases, activists were prosecuted for illegal buildings or unlawful occupation of public lands. And so, local level initiatives are therefore not a solution against the discrimination suffered by the Alevis. The issues of the non-recognition of cemevleri as places of worship come up again when considering the problem of their maintenance. Running a GMV requires continuous financial and professional support, also considering the cost of utility bills, and that it often becomes prohibitively. Eran Kurtarir explains that some small-scale cemevleri in Istanbul faces harsh economic difficulties and must stop to carry out their tasks during winter to avoid heating expenses. In this regard, it is worth mentioning that Turkish law guarantees numerous economic benefits to the places of worship recognized as such, including the exemption from paying water and electricity bills. But again, the problem is that cemevleri cannot access to these subsidies because of the limitation imposed to them by law. According to Nazli Özcan, in 2014, the government guided by Ahmet Davutoğlu proposed to expand the law that covers the utility expenses of the cemevleri of the places of worship to include also cemevleri. While doing so, however, state officials also suggested a distinction between places of worship and prayer rooms, categorizing cemevleri under the latter category. Even though not actualized, this suggestion showed that the government considered covering the utilities of the utility expenses, of the cemevleri with the state budget as a bargain to avoid legally recognizing them as full-fledged places of worship. It seemed that the government problem was not the extension of benefits to the cemevleri, but their designation as places of worship, thus equating them with mosques, synagogues, and churches. A rendition that in the official articulation that could open the way for the depiction of Alevism as a religion on a par with Islam. The reading of this issue was of course rejected by the Alevi activists because the question of extending the benefits according to places of worship to the cemevleri is not only a question of economic disparity, but above all, a question of identity. Once again, as with other issues throughout history, it seemed that the government was ignoring the religious, social, and political inequalities that Alevism must face and that created this situation in the first place. It is requested here, just one moment, to understand how a building can be declared as a place of worship under the Turkish law. The body delegated to decide on such matter is the Diyanet, and which among its tasks is precisely that of administering the places of worship. In this regard, the matter itself is contradictory within the Turkish law as a specific regulation on defining a place of worship and granting such a status to a building. Well, it lacks. Even the Yargıtay, the Turkish Supreme Court, does not provide any further hint on the subject. And so there is no regulatory or constitutional obstacle within the Turkish law that could be established as a legal basis for not granting to the Alevis claim concerning the cemevleri. On the other hand, the concrete reality is that Omuroidin and Bulut Gurpinar explained that in reality, only the buildings belonging to the three great monotheistic religions, I mean Christianity, Judaism, and of course Islam, are as recognized as places of worship by the Diyanet and may enjoy the benefits guaranteed to them by law. Diyanet position regarding Alevi claim is very clear. Gemeevleri cannot be designated as places of worship because Alevism is not a religion in its own right, but a mere interpretation of Islam. Alevis are therefore not entitled to have their Gemeevleri recognized as places of worship because they are buildings in which culture and not religious activity take place. Secondly, since they are in fact Muslims, Alevis can pray in mosques. Such an interpretation of Alevism is prevalent within the Turkish state and represents the main line of defense against the Alevi complaints. Due to this hostile attitude on part of the Turkish state and the continued denial of their demands, Alevi activists went the way of the European institution, filing complaints within the European Courts of Human Rights in 2014 and in other times. A few words about European law in this regard are required here. The legal framework that Alevis referred to in submitting the appeals to the European Courts of Human Rights is based on the European Convention of Human Rights, to which Turkey is also a party, and that protects the right to have a place of worship as an extension of freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. In this regard, the jurisprudence of the European Courts of Human Rights has established several assumptions concerning places of worship. First, the Convention guarantees to a religion such buildings devoted to worship, but does not oblige a member state to provide such structures, not to grant them a special status. But at the same time, the Convention ensures that a state may establish special privilege for a religious community and might grant it a special legal status. But if this special position is granted to one religious community, other religious communities should also be entitled to request the same privileges for themselves. It's therefore understood that whether these principles applies to the case of the Alevis, it would require Turkey to guarantee to other religious communities other than Sunni Muslims the same dignity and equal treatment. In concrete terms, according to the European Courts of Human Rights, Turkey should extend the same benefits enjoyed by mosques to the Gemeevleri. And this is exactly what happened, because the European Courts of Human Rights ruled in favor of the Alevi petitions both in 2014 and 2016, concluding that Turkey violated their freedom of religious and belief. But even in the face of the court's pronouncement, however, the Turkish state has been very reluctant to accept Alevi's claims, thus perpetuating the discriminatory policy that this minority has faced since the birth of the Republic. Unfortunately. While not wishing to go back over the historical events that have often seen the Alevis treated as second-class citizens, it must be acknowledged here that the issue of the Gemeevleri is only a part of a broader range of Alevi demands on the Diyanet and on the government. Such pleas that are almost constantly ignored by Turkish authorities are always inherent in protecting or promoting identity and/or religious issues, such as the exemption of Alevi pupils from the compulsory religious courses, or are inherent in demanding respect for the grief suffered by the Alevis as a minority in the course of history, for example, the trials concerning the Sivas massacre. The constant disregard of the state for the Alevis, which persists despite the alternating forces in government, suggests that there is a willingness to ignore their uniqueness as a religious and cultural group, as recognizing them would undermine the homogeneity of the Turkish society. Indeed, for example, Ceren Lord believes that since the beginning of its history, and even more so after the 80s, the Republic of Turkey, through the Diyanet, has pursued the design of homogenizing society by also acting through religion. The Diyanet, a body that was initially meant to establish state control over religion, has thus ended up actively sponsoring Sunnism of the Hanafi school and its spread within the society. Demands concerning identity and religion issues from the Alevis have therefore often been seen as a disruptive force, for which the only response has been attempts to assimilate this minority within the broader Sunni community, or to ignore each of their instances by downplaying them, as the government did, for example, in 2008 with the failed Alevi Ajleme. The legal struggle initiated by the Alevi activists has enabled them to achieve some gains in the European arena, but despite the favorable decision of the European Court, there is still a lack of internal developments in Turkey. And unfortunately, to this day, the Cemevleri are not recognized as places of worship, and their survival, given also the economic difficulties that Turkey is facing right now, still hangs in balance. Concluding, it must be emphasized here that the importance of Cemevleri for the Alevis is not only as a building per se, but also as a symbol. Besides their religious importance, Cemevleri represents a visible sign of Alevi identity, beliefs, and also their mere existence as a community. It is only thanks to their construction that Alevi's traditional rituals and culture may reproduce in urban settings and avoid to getting lost. Such buildings are also important from a social point of view, as they are often foster a network of communal interactions and fill the gap of inequitable and insufficient public service provisions in those quarters inhabited by the Alevis. If they were to disappear due to economic or legal difficulties, life would be more difficult in the Alevi neighborhoods. And so the recognition of Cemevleri as places of worship and the extension to them of the benefits that come with such status, therefore, is not only a very serious negation of the rights of the Alevis, but also a prejudice that compromises the quality of the daily lives of this minority. Many thanks for the attention, and sorry again for the technical issues.